All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, great. Good morning. Thank you for coming to this session today. I've been chugging coffee out in the hallway, which I now think was a mistake. So we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Joe Marciniak, and the session is the EResources Bootcamp. Just to make sure that everybody's in the right place, we are going to be talking about a broad overview of the responsibilities of the EResources Librarian. And a lot of sessions usually go like a deep dive into license negotiation or something like that. So this session is more designed to give you the overview of the responsibilities and the workload, and then you to take that information and identify topics that you might need to take a deeper look at in the future. So I'm going to be using a lot of different examples today, and I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the different types of institutions. So previous institution was a private college, but also very small, about 1,000 FTE. And then I was at a mid-sized public university, part of a state system where we had about an FTE of 14,000. And then I'm currently at a private university with an FTE of around 8,000. In terms of the session agenda, I want to focus a lot on the EResources Lifecycle, and I'll talk about why in a little bit. We also want to talk about collection development responsibilities of EResources librarians, managing access issues, license negotiations, payment and technical setup, maintenance and renewal, and then also job profiles and interviews, just some things that I think are useful or helpful when you're starting to look for a position as an EResources librarian. One of the challenges is that a lot of people, EResources librarians are very much in demand, but not so much at entry level. So a lot of people really want someone to come in that they don't have to train to do this kind of work. So it's very hard to get started, or at least I found that it was. So, and a lot of times you're filling a position where there is no one to train you because that person is gone. So this is the EResources Lifecycle. This is a free document. I'll show you, you can get it from the NASIG website, and I find this to be very, very helpful. The nice thing about this is that you can actually use this as a checklist of your EResources librarian. If you are acquiring any resource or managing a collection or anything like that, all of these stages need to be taken care of and attended to by you. The other reason why I really like this diagram is because even though those three institutions I put up there previous were so different, nothing changes with this diagram. All of these need to be handled no matter what institution you're at, and that's why it's very useful. Now, what will change, as I'll show you today, is who does them, how quickly they get done, and those types of things. But again, the document doesn't change no matter what institution you're at. This is the life cycle of an electronic resource, and you have to maintain every aspect of it. This is the NASIG website where you can download this free in multiple formats, and I highly recommend anybody who's interested in EResources librarianship, go ahead and grab this, read through it, and again, use it to identify some topics that you might need to explore in depth on your own. So if I go back to the life cycle and bring up this is not an actual workflow, this is nonsense, or maybe it just had, I was free to reuse it. And this is the big difference when you look at those different institutions I put up there and what your role will be as the EResources librarian is it's all about workflow. It's all about understanding the workflow for processing things at your institution and who does what. So if you're at a large institution, you might not be responsible for all of those stages of the life cycle, but you're going to be responsible for making sure that they all get done. With that very first institution that I put up there with only about 1,000 FTE, I was the only person working on all of it. So I could literally just use it as a checklist of whether or not I had done it. I'm at an institution now, you might get one that has staff, maybe other librarians that are dedicated to EResources support. And so you're going to need to learn the workflow of your institution and realize, particularly when you're looking for a job, how that's going to change the management of that workflow. It's a lot of work when you're the only one doing it, but there's also a lot of freedom in that, right? So when you're working with a team, it changes your focus of how you manage EResources. You're now doing a lot more collaborative work instead of doing it independently. So going back to the life cycle though, if I just focus on this one stage, the acquiring stage, and I just went through and just kind of made a list of all of the people who are involved in each stage of just this acquiring stage. And you can see that we've got a lot of things in here. You've got your the people, your boss, the people who have the money. You have your patrons. This is from the academic institution. You've got the institution legal department. You also have the vendor's legal department, the sales reps, the budget in-house, the budgeting personnel at the vendor. But you can see obviously that I'm involved in every one of these steps. So the constant here is you. And that brings me to the next slide of something that I want to talk about that a lot of people don't talk about with e-resources. A lot of times people think that what you need, the most important thing that you need is technical knowledge and skills. And I'm not going to deny that. You need to know how to work with ILSs, LSPs. You need to know about off-campus authentication. We're going to talk about all that in the rest of the session. But when I make a list of the skills that I use on a daily basis, there are kind of obvious ones, but not ones that people think about in terms of e-resources. So things like these skills, which unfortunately sometimes are called soft skills. And because when you go back to all of those people that are involved in just one stage of the 5 stages of managing an e-resource, this is what I use every day, and this is what I use all the time. Your organizational skills, you might be the only one managing thousands of resources and subscriptions, and there's not going to be anyone to catch it if it falls through the cracks until there's a problem, and then you realize that you made a mistake. So staying organized is key. I heard someone in another session I was in said something about spreadsheets, a spreadsheet for their spreadsheets. This is the area that we're talking about here. Now you're going to want to have ERMSs and ILSs and those things that can help you manage that as well. But you're going to need to be focused on organization. Problem solving is essential because people are going to report access issues to you. So you need to be able to quickly work through some of those access problems and develop a little checklist for yourself, some workflow for yourself. That's going to be your responsibility. Also, communication is just so important. Again, a lot of times when I meet people and I tell them what I do, and we'll talk about the names that you will be called in a later slide, they think that I'm in a server room and that I'm like a computer nerd and all of these things, which doesn't mean that they're not true, but you're going to spend so much of your time communicating with people, and you're going to communicate with very diverse people. So you're going to have vendors, you're going to have tech supported vendors, you're going to be talking to financial people, you're going to be talking to patrons who by the time they get to you, they've already talked to a couple of people and they're already frustrated. So you really need to be able to communicate clearly and concisely with people, and I always recommend using visuals, and we'll talk about that in a slide a little bit later. Independent learning is really important. So the problem with e-resources is not a lack of documentation. So say you have Alma, you can go to Ex Libris, they have all of their documentation is open and freely available. You can bring up the Managing e-resources document and you will have hundreds of pages with links at your fingertips. So it's not a documentation problem, it's a finding the solution problem. So you need to get better at, or as good as you can be at, reading technical documents, scanning through them quickly to solve a problem. Because that's what you're going to be working on. You're not working on presenting on behalf of this ERMS or LSP, it's figuring something out and going from there. So what you really need is just a whole lot of determination. And you will be surprised that when you're dealing with this life cycle, how many times you have to pick the ball up from where you put it and get it started again. Because you're working with so many different people who all have these very different workflows. And you're also going to be surprised at how hard it is to get stuff done, like paying an invoice. It sounds really silly, but it's something that you're going to be responsible for. The way that I talk about e-resources is that it's kind of everything that happens with the resource, but you're format specific. So you kind of have to know a little bit about how to do everything, how to code invoices, who you need to talk to, how they get paid. Is it by credit card? Is it by bank transfer? Is it going to be a check that's going to be mailed? All those kinds of things. So again, kind of going back to what I do on a daily basis is a lot of hounding people, a lot of bugging people. When I make my subject line in my email, it just says lots of stuff like, sorry about, it's right in there so I don't have to retype it every time, because especially the more vendors that you have, the more you're going to be doing that. So I'm going to jump right into the collection development responsibilities of the electronic resources librarian. So what I was just talking about with format is really important to me, because the interesting thing about an e-resources librarian is that you're format based, not subject based. So maybe like a selector or somebody else, they deal with the subject, but your format. And your format actually touches all the subjects. So there is a tendency to confuse your format with subject expertise. And I'm here to reassure everyone that if somebody hands you a title list of 14,000 biology journals, you can be comfortable saying that you don't know if that is a collection you should subscribe to or not. You need to work with other people to evaluate it. When I look at collections, and we have all the stages here, you identify a need, you contact the vendor, you do a trial, you evaluate it, you negotiate price, process the payment, establish access, analyze the usage, and provide support. That's all your job. When I look at a title list, I pay attention to things like embargoes. I pay attention to the platform that students and patrons are going to access it from. I pay attention to maybe the citation index, the impact of those journals, but I'm not an expert in that field. So no matter where you are, your first job is to find people to help you evaluate collections and resources. The good news is that I haven't found, despite the difference of all those three institutions, I haven't found people unwilling to do that. People like to do this work. They like to participate in collections decisions. They like to review resources. They like to talk about things. So this is my encouragement slide, that don't get confused with the fact that you deal with format, meaning that you are supposed to be an expert on this collection of rare ebooks that has been digitized. You need to find the experts at your institution, even outside of the library, to help you work through those title lists. You need to be focused on, like I said, the embargoes, the access, the platform, the linking, all of that kind of technical stuff that makes sure that it works off campus for patrons. You know, the things like the DRM, can they download, can they print, how do they save it, do they have to create an account? If they create an account, what information does the vendor collect? That's your area. So don't feel bad about that. Okay, so ebook collection development warrants its own little slide. So one of these options is DDA. Everybody's probably heard of demand-driven acquisition, where patrons make purchases based on certain parameters. And this was a model that I've had varied success with in the past. And the reason is basically because patrons don't know that they're making purchasing decisions, and also patrons don't know your collection. So it's also about how results are displayed in your system. I was at a university in Georgia, and we had a DDA program, and we found that all of these books had been purchased over the weekend on the Civil War. We had some books on the Civil War already, but they weren't discovered by the patron, and then we had spent money on all of them. So I'm for DDA programs as long as you have curated that pool very carefully. You need to be able to say, without a doubt, we would like to buy every book in this pool. We don't know which ones, so we're going to open those in our discovery or in our catalog, and then let the patrons make the decision. And also, you know, again, that aspect of them not knowing that they're buying something. If you think about yourself on YouTube or somewhere else, everything that you click on, you wouldn't necessarily if you were paying money, right? So patrons are clicking, they're exploring, and it's triggering a purchase. Another model is the evidence-based acquisition. I like this one a little more than DDA, and the way that this works is that you agree with the vendor ahead of time on an agreed upon spend. So we're going to give you $10,000 at the end of 2020, and that's agreed upon. And then for the year of 2020, the vendor will open a package of resources, completely all of them, to everybody at the institution, and then you'll be able to track usage throughout the year. At the end of that year, you're going to give the vendor the agreed upon spend, in this example, the $10,000, but you get to decide what you pick. And it doesn't have to be the ones that were used the most. You can look at that list and say, yeah, this ebook has hundreds of uses, but we're actually pretty confident in our collection in that area. So the EBA is a little bit of a tweak on the DDA, and I like it a little bit better. If you want to spend money, this is the way to do it. So we did a demand-driven acquisition program at a previous institution, not my current one, and we spent $5,000 in 11 days. We bought 36 books, but we carefully curated the list that were in that collection. So as the follow-up for me, I consulted with the liaisons who curated those titles and showed them what we had bought, and they were happy with all the purchases, which is your goal. There's nothing worse than looking at some of these programs and saying, I really wouldn't have bought that many books. And this is really complicated. I'm simplifying with a slide. You set certain parameters with publishers. You can pick date range, publishers, all that kind of stuff. But these are two options for collection development when you're dealing with books. Streaming media is another huge one. I think there's a session, looks like there's a couple sessions here at Charleston about this. I'm going to one of them. You've got some major players, Canopy, Avon, Swank, Film Platform, all that. And one thing that this slide is just not to go into that because that is a whole session on its own, but these are just 3 examples of streaming media resources that I contacted the production company directly, secured a license with them. 2 of them were perpetual, 1 was 5 years. Then I was able to get the file, host it internally on a server, build a link, and put it in the catalog. Now, you obviously can't do that with thousands of titles, but I just like to bring this up to say we can handle some streaming media in the way that we've handled some other resources in the past. And if there's something that is a professor or a patron really wants, don't forget to explore contacting that production company. And I will say that none of these were that expensive. So it's also an option to kind of take matters into your own hand if you have a title or 2 that you need. So one of the ways that you can add value with collection development is an overlap analysis, right? Like I said, you don't need to be an expert on all the journals in that field, But what you do need to communicate and be an expert on is what content is unique. If you think you're going to find a package with 100% unique content, you're wrong. So just get used to being comfortable with a percentage and be upfront with that, with your selectors, with the people in your library. This has 75% unique content. That's your responsibility with collection development. Again, not an expert on how good that journal is, but do you have it somewhere else? Impact factors is also important, depending on who you talk to, of varying importance, but it's something that you want to be able to present. You want to have that ready if somebody asks, well, how important are these journals? You can present that information to say, well, this is cited X amount of times in the literature and that kind of thing. Embargoes is huge. A lot of times you might hear this referred to as like a rolling wall or something like that. So it means that you have a current subscription, but not the most previous 12 months. Well, if you're at a heavy research institution, that's going to be a fairly big deal. Again, you often don't have control over that, but you want to be aware of that. That's something you want to have ready when you're presenting a title list to somebody for purchase. This is one that I think is really helpful and something that sort of is within your grasp at an institution, is to know what's going on with the curriculum. If you have recently launched a new minor at your institution, then be on the lookout for some collections that might support that. That's a way that you can add value and say, hey, we just launched this minor last year. I really think that this collection might work. And then you would work with the selector or faculty or experts to decide if that's something that you should go ahead and move forward with. And then also knowledge of the collection, so what you already have. This sounds really easy and simple, but it gets complicated fast, especially when you start talking about all of these overlaps and things that you have. And depending on the institution that you are at, there may be thousands of databases alone that you have to familiarize yourself with. So you need to kind of at least be aware of what's available there. And again, you want to work, this is not all on you. Work with your selectors. A lot of times there's research guides. They said at the session this morning that there's, we don't have a shortage of research guides out there. So you can find those ones that are being recommended in that field and at least be aware of what you already have. You can also work with your vendors as well to find out, exactly what you have and keep track of that. Okay, so the next big thing that's important for you is how people tell you something doesn't work. So these are both SpringShare examples, and these are both ones that I've used and do use. So whatever your mechanism is your responsibility, and really something that you should care a lot about, which I do, and is part of my bigger picture slide later on, is really the goal of all this is making sure that your patrons have access to the materials remotely. People research everywhere, and now with the growing number of online programs, this is just a necessity. So when something doesn't work, you need to be able to find out about it. So the example on your right is a simple LibGuide form, and it's good, it got the job done, but it didn't create a ticketing system for me, and it didn't really create statistics the way that I wanted to. The one in the middle or at the bottom is LibAnswers, and that creates a ticketing system. You can see who the last person replied in. It creates dates. You can pull some statistics with it from it. A couple of things just to say about reporting access issues. So if you are going to be an eResources librarian and you're the only person doing that work, I have bad news for you if you like your Saturdays and Sundays. Okay, and so the reason for this is not that it will take a lot of your time to help patrons, but you need to be available or someone does. My previous institution had a lot of distance learning programs, and they were working adults, professionals with families and kids. When do you think that they do their homework that's due Monday? It's Saturday or Sunday. And if you're not getting back to them until Monday morning, it's not going to help them. So, some of this is knowing your patron base, making sure there's a plan. It doesn't have to be you. But there is a time-sensitive factor to this, and there's good reason for it, I guess. You can say all you want about, yeah, you should have done this 3 weeks ago so you could have ILL'd that book, but it's not what's going to happen. So if your focus is just on getting people what they want, they need to be able to report access issues to you. You don't always need to solve them. You'd be surprised at how many tech support vendors aren't even working on the weekend. You email an emergency or what you think is an emergency on Saturday afternoon, they're like, cool, we'll look at it Monday morning. And you're like, well, so what do you do then? You have to work with the patron to identify an alternative source. And now you're doing some reference work. Now you're doing the reference interview over chat or email. And hopefully isn't one that's been actually specifically assigned. So you want to make sure that you have an ability to communicate with the patrons and keep track of it. License negotiations. So this is a whole session at every conference that I go to. And I want to touch on it because it's important. There's a couple things that you need to keep in mind. First is, I know you're not a lawyer probably, although there were a few people in library school that were lawyers. but you're going to be reading licenses. So you might have internal legal departments at your institution that you can work with. You might be working on it on your own. The things you need to pay attention to is within the license, who is described as your user base and your patrons. Some of them are very vague, and so you can move forward with that. But if you think it's easy to just say, well, our patrons are, then you're not thinking about retired people, you're not thinking about emeritus faculty. What about sponsored researchers working with one of your professors on a research project? There's all these different types of categories that exist as part of your patron base. Again, if the license is vague and they sort of leave it up to you, that's okay. If they get really specific about currently enrolled faculty or currently enrolled students and faculty, then you need to talk to them about how, what that means to you. Which laws govern the license? So if you are dealing with an international company, I recently just dealt with a company in Italy and one in France. They're not going to change the laws that govern the license. It's going to be Italy and France. In the United States, you can often get the vendor to change the license, the laws that govern the license to the state you're in. That's usually preferable. In Georgia, when I was at the state institution, that was a requirement. We couldn't agree to a license that was governed by another state's laws. So that's something that you want to just pay attention to and be aware of. Again, if it's international, you're not going to have any luck changing it to United States laws, but if it's within the United States, it's going to be preferable to have it by the laws of your state. Translated licenses, so a lot of licenses that get translated into English, it's actually the native language that will settle any disputes that arise. So if there's enough risk factors involved with the license, you may need to get somebody that can read the original language if you can't. Late payment fees are a big one. Almost every license says 30 days. It doesn't hurt to ask for 60 or 90. You definitely don't want to be dealing with the problem later at day 29 when you could have just said, hey, we'd like that changed to 60 days. Always try to get it as long as possible because, as I said earlier, it's a lot harder to pay some of these invoices than you think it would be. So recently I've had a couple of licenses where the provider wants the patron to be aware of the licensing terms, which is kind of weird because the whole license says we're responsible for everything as an institution anyway. So why do the patrons then also need to agree to this? And so what we did is we just sort of worked out some alternate language. We sent that back to them. We went back and forth a little bit. I mean, we basically just said, hey, we're not in the practice of exposing licensing terms to our patrons. This is what we can offer. We feel like it meets the criteria of what you had in your license. And they both agreed to it, and we were able to move forward. But that's something you need to be aware of is what level of patron awareness are they asking you to expose these terms to? Special requirements. So working with another provider right now that has requested a photograph of the workstation where people will be able to access the resource. They requested a list of the people who will have the login credentials. They've requested information about how the people will be logged in and out of the resource. So you need to pay attention to special requirements. That's fine, you just work with the vendor on it, but you don't want to find out after you've already agreed and signed some things that, hey, you need to actually have all this oversight over how the resource will be accessed and managed. So this price is not part of the license, but I didn't want to create a whole extra slide for it, so I just slipped it in here at the end. So price negotiation, a lot of times you just need to know that most prices are based on FTEs. The trouble is after you've worked at a couple of different institutions, you realize that that's not true, but that's a session for a completely other time. But what you do have with price is you can negotiate a little bit maybe based on the user-based FTE. So maybe just the FTE of the nursing students, of the nursing school, or the degree people, the people who declare degrees, and maybe get that pricing down a little bit more. You can also look at your overall spend with that vendor and say, hey, we spent X amount of dollars with you last year. What do you think about a discount for this amount? And then you can also pay attention to downtime, which is where that ticketing system comes in. You can say, hey, X amount of time last year, we were having trouble with this platform. We'd like to see that reflected in a discount on this next product. So you do have some options with price negotiation, and I do encourage you, this is one area where I do encourage you to do that deeper dive with some of the sessions here. I think there's a couple here at this conference where they're also going to have the vendors there too, which is really helpful. Speaking of money, flat budgets. So you as the EResources librarian are going to keep track of how much all of these subscriptions increase every year, or stay the same. A few do, but most don't. They increase. It's going to be between 4 and 5%. Depending on whether or not they add new titles, it might be as high as 17%. And your job as the EResources librarian is to communicate to your administrators that there is no such thing as a flat budget. If you give me the same money every year, you're actually telling me to cut resources. I'll be able to hold out for a little while, a couple of years, but you're telling me to cut. If you want me to keep what we already have, our awesome collection, then I need at least a 5% increase on my budget every year. And if you want me to buy new resources to support that new program, I need even more for that. So you may not be the person involved with budget at a granular level, but this is what you always want to be able to present. You want to have 3 to 5 years of how much this package has increased over time because it hasn't gone down. So moving on to the technical setup. A to Z list. So now you've bought something and it's all about making, there's nothing worse than going through all of this work and buying something and then like nobody knows about it and nobody uses it. And I have a marketing slide here later. This is all very dependent on the institution that you are in. But you want to make sure you start getting it out there. So A to Z list, I've been in institutions that have 2 A to Z lists. Some are in Drupal, some are in LibGuides. So however you guys make resources known, you want to put them in the A to Z list. You want to make sure that they're in the discovery service, whatever you're using. Make sure that you know that it's displaying there. You want to check that. Make sure that it's showing up in the catalog. You want to test remote access. I always test remote access before I even announce something. I thought I had another one there. Remote access warrants its own slide. So there's a bunch of different types of remote access, and the first one and probably the most popular is EasyProxy. And I'll show you an example of the EasyProxy stanza in a little bit. This is an OCLC product. It's very basic, but it's worked for a long time and works for most purposes for remote authentication. It basically just makes it look like the patron is coming from your institution's IP range. Open Athens is more like a suite. When I was at the University of West Georgia, we were migrating to Open Athens, and it comes with a lot of bells and whistles. It allows you to create and manage user groups. It has an admin portal where you can track usage. It has a lot of automatic updates with titles if you subscribe to packages that will be automatically put into your system. So Open Athens is more of a robust platform for managing remote access. There's also browser authentication. You may know about some things like Lean Library or ReadCube papers. There's a lot that's going on with browser work. So once a patron logs in via the browser, it creates sort of like a token that lasts for 8 hours or longer, as long as they don't clear their history or anything like that. Then the patron, wherever they find the resource on Google Scholar or wherever it may be, will show up as if they have access to it. So browser authentication is something that I think is pretty neat. And then VPN is virtual private networks, secure remote access, I think. So that's where you have, excuse me, that's where you have the means to teleport into your computer that's actually on campus. So EasyProxy example, since it's kind of the most common, I think, is that all of these stanzas are freely available on OCLC's website. You can go there and you can just look at this giant A to Z list and click on it. It tells you the last time that was updated. A lot of times if we have access issues and I've already replicated it off campus, then I'll go and check to see when the stanza was updated last. And then you know if it has been that you need to update the config file, the configuration file that's sitting on your EasyProxy server. This is what they look like. So you can see that the one on the left is a lot more robust than the one on the right. The one on the right is one that I made up. So there was not a stanza in EasyProxy for Mirabile, which we recently started a subscription to. And you can just follow the example on the left, or ones that already exist, and create your own, put it into the config file, restart the server, and then you're good to go. Access will work off campus. So if you're interested in this kind of work, then you're going to want to make sure, wow, I'm doing really bad on time. You're going to want to make sure that you don't waste a lot of time. So if you want to learn about LSPs or ILSs, then the one that you need to learn about is Alma, just because it's in the most libraries. So if you're casting a wide net, looking for a job, this is one to familiarize yourself with. This is from Marshall Breeding's Library Technology Guides. If you're not aware of Marshall Breeding and this website and his guides, I highly recommend going to it. That's always very useful information. Marketing, this goes back to that workflow. So when I was at that very small institution, I would just email all the faculty. There was only about 75 or 80 full-time faculty. I had a really close relationship with them. We got a new resource. I didn't really pay a lot of attention to people's subject area, just sort of letting everybody know that we were subscribing to this, we were subscribing to that. It didn't create so much that they stopped reading it because it was irrelevant and it was just easier to do. You move to a larger institution and a lot of your faculty and your patrons, they don't want to get anything that doesn't relate to their field of study. So you're going to have to work a lot closely with the liaisons to make sure that they're the ones disseminating it. And you also might be lucky enough for there to be an actual marketing department that can help you professionalize some of those rollouts and things like that. So assessment renewal is a big part of your job, and it depends a little bit on the institution, like everything else here. So we have Counter. You may be aware of Counter Statistics, counting online usage of networked electronic resources, I think, is that where that comes from. So Counter is good, and the reason why Counter is good is because it's a standard, right? It's not perfect, but what you're trying to do is compare apples to apples. So instead of getting the usage statistics from a vendor, like from EBSCO and from ProQuest, they're now trying to have this sort of standard so that it's apples to apples, so that you can at least compare across provider the usage that you're having. But I also really recommend taking advantage of the resource sharing in the ILL department. Nobody knows more about what people are using at your institution than the resource sharing folks. I've found them to be really, really valuable when I'm looking at a title list. I mean, like within minutes, they can look through the title list and they can say, oh, we've had X amount of requests for this journal, or I've never even heard of these, our patrons don't use these. That's not to say that you don't need to involve faculty and specialists, but don't forget about the resource sharing department, the ILL folks. They really know what people are requesting at your institution. And then also percents of percents, right? So what percent of a package is providing for what percent of use? If you have only 1% of the package and 80% of the usage coming from that, then you may want to look at subscribing individually to some journals rather than having a whole package. And I think I have an example of that. Right, so this is a real example of a journal package that had 2,500 titles in it, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to go through and figure this out. So what I learned was that there were actually 20 journals with 20 or more full text requests were 108. And now that sounds small, but if you were to go out and price subscribing to 108 journals directly, you would well exceed the cost of this package. But this is the information that you want to have available to your supervisor, to the other librarians, say this package is worth it. Because if we, 20 or more full text requests for me was good at the time, and that isn't something that we want to lose. Now, if you do this and you find that that number is 8 at the bottom there, then you might be able to do some pricing directly with the vendors and think about canceling a large package. So where can you work? 88% academic. This is from 2017. So it's dominated a lot by the academic market. And this is, again, just to show you if you want to be e-resources, but you're really passionate and want to work in a public library, just be aware of how you're limiting your job prospects. It's highly academic world to get used to for the e-resources librarian. This is just a word cloud. This is also from 2017, taking in all of the job postings for that year for eResources Librarian. You can see that a lot of these are generic ones like skills and ability that would have gone into those other things that we talked about earlier, communication skills, the ability to work with others, things like that. The one that I want to highlight here is the demonstrates. When you're doing a job interview, I've found that one really clear, well-told demonstration, almost like a story, is more impactful than sort of that list of everything that you worked on. One really clear example from the beginning to the end of working through a problem, working with a vendor, providing access, working on a resource is something that I think sticks with the hiring committee a little bit more than sort of, here's everything that I've ever done. That's in your CV. They can see that if they want to, but when you're doing the interviewing, you really want to focus on clear demonstrations that address the question that's been asked with details. So speaking of job profiles and interviews, the less detail in the job posting, the more responsibility you're going to have. We call this wearing many hats. And it's not bad. When I was at that small institution, I got to do a lot more than I ever would have anywhere else, and it was great. It really was. Just be aware of what you're walking into. If you are a person who likes structured responsibilities, then that might not be for you. You're going to want to see more detail there. Always ask about the relationship with the IT department. Just like that workflow, it doesn't change from institution to institution, neither does working with IT. And if you're at a large enough institution, there will be a library IT department, so now you have 2 layers of IT. So you want to find out, if you ask this question and it's followed by a lot of laughter on the other end, just know what you're in for, right? So you're going to be working a little bit more. And you want to make sure that they are aware of this. If there's no response and there's no ticketing system, then you got a lot of work to do developing those relationships when you start that job. Ability to edit the web page. This is like the proxy server. Do you have access to the config file? Can you restart the server? How do you post alerts? How do you let people know things are happening in your library? If you can, then you've got this lag. I mean, if a resource goes down and it's going to take a day to get approved by the web development people, that's not very helpful. So you need to be thinking about, how do you communicate with patrons at large, not just the ones that come in directly to you. Org chart. So if you don't see a systems librarian at the library you're going to, guess who the systems librarian is? That's you. It's not going to be in the job profile, but you're going to be responsible for a lot of what would be falling under the systems librarian profile at a large university. So be aware of that as well. How do you communicate with patrons, a little bit going back there, but this is a little bit more about what's acceptable. You know, how casual is it? How do you email with patrons? How do you post things with them? There's different structures that are in place at all these institutions. Committees, always just be aware of the committee workload that you're going to be asked to do. Committees are great. They take up a lot of time though. So you want to make sure that you're aware of the responsibilities that will be on you for participating in committees. You want to know if your position is tenure track. Is it going to be multi-year agreements? Just how is it yearly? Is it 3 years? How does it work? And what kind of review process you're going to have and what's going to be the focus of those types of things. How invoices are paid, this is my favorite one because it just sounds like it shouldn't even be up here, but it really is. It's so different at every institution, and even the level, like the amount that you're paying. If it's over 8,000, it's this. If it's over 10,000, it's this. And you really need to have a lot of knowledge about how things are paid and develop those relationships in the finance department as much as you would anywhere else. Back to my you're not a lawyer slide. You're not a lawyer, but you're going to be asked about copyright. So this is an area that I've gotten a lot more comfortable in, and it's you find that a lot of faculty are really just looking for help. They're looking for a conversation. You're not going to get sued if you give them the wrong advice. This is not to say don't take advantage of a legal department if you have one. You definitely need to do that, and I do and have done that. But don't freak out either when faculty want to start talking to you about copyright. You know, a lot of times they're really just looking for someone to have a conversation with, and the information about copyright and being translated into understandable terms has gotten more and more available to everyone. And so you should feel a little bit more comfortable about looking at some of this stuff, engaging with it. Most of the time at academic institutions, it's actually fairly easy because a lot of it will fall under the educational fair use. And as long as those resources are put behind a page that requires them to enter their institutional information credentials, not their personal Gmail, then there's not going to be very many problems, especially when they're posting on course pages and things like that, like course day. So you will be called names. This is just my fun slide to show you the things that I've been called. Computer librarian, that's first and foremost. You will be a computer librarian. IT person in the library, it's pretty straightforward. Electric resources librarian. See, I think an electric resource is a microwave, but I have been called that. This is very, very complimentary. Professor of libraries, I still don't know what it means. And chair of electric resources, which is the most depressing because I heard my wife tell her friend that this is what I was over the phone. So as long as you know what you're doing, everything's okay. Don't worry about what you're going to be called because it's all these, and I'm excited to hear what else I'll be called in the future. So this is my contact information. I really mean it. If you have any questions, just email me. I like engaging and talking to people about eResources. We do have, I think, about 5 minutes left for questions maybe. So if you have some, feel free to bring them up now, but seriously, feel free to reach out with me for any other information. Thank you. Any questions now? Yeah.
When you contacted the production company for streaming video, that's really provocative to me. How was the selection made? Do you still use Canopy and go around Canopy? And then how are you hosting?
Sure. Okay, so for those specific examples, they were at an institution where we didn't have any video streaming service except for Films on Demand. So those requests came in very strong from faculty who wanted to use them in their course. These were anthropology courses, and these other platforms were simply unavailable to us, just money-wise. So I reached out to them and I let them know what we wanted to, wanted to use these as in courses, but we also wanted them to be in our catalog and not have restrictions. So a lot of it was just working out the license with the production companies. Once they sent the video file to me, which we just did electronically, then I worked with the IT department and I got space on our server that required a password to access. It was just a video server space. You're really just asking for space, which they don't usually care about. And then when I uploaded it to that server, I was able to create the link just from the file up, and I added our proxy server prefix, which you would all get to know if you have a proxy server. and then we were able to build the catalog record and put that in as the access right there. Again, that's not anything you'd want to do with a lot of titles. That maintenance would be crazy, but if you're in that tight situation where video streaming is expected by faculty, and they're not really going to understand why you can't just have this. So it might help you out a little bit in tough situations, but a lot of work for sure.
Do you have any suggestions for people who are in the position of being staff, and because you are qualified to be a librarian, you're expected to have the same accessibility as a librarian, but you're still limited by your hours?
I mean, I think that, so the way that I started out was I was a technology applications assistant. So the one thing that I would say is that most places, whatever eResources work is being done, there's a need for help for it. And so I would say that you want to start gaining experience that way. In terms of if your time is limited, then you're going to have to focus more on maybe a specific aspect of eResources management, something like that. Like if you really, whatever is the most appealing to you, like working with the proxy server, solving, maybe responding to access issues that come in, or maybe looking at that, taking a really close look at the collection development, coming and saying, this could really help us. We're seeing we have almost 85% overlap between these two collections. So it may be focusing on one aspect of that life cycle, and then that's a better utilizing your time rather than trying to absorb it all. That might be something. Okay, I think we're out of time. Oh, yeah.
You're out of time?
No, go ahead.
I have a lot of questions. I sort of got thrust into doing books and retiring at the time where we were trying to move from one resource vendor to another resource vendor, and I had no idea what I was doing. But at the end of it, I guess I'm really just making a recommendation. Try to get your predecessor to write out the workflows. It was kind of a lousy situation because they kept saying, when are you going to get this up? When are you going to get this up? And the bottom line is, we had some purchased eBooks, and I didn't want to overlay the records so that purchase information would be gone. So I was really afraid to proceed. And I don't know, it was kind of a mess. So you could get the workflow before somebody leaves.
Yeah, and it's so dependent on we didn't even get into the ILSs and LSPs. LSPs, Library Services Platform, it sort of does everything, has a lot of fields for notes and documentation, so something like that would be more helpful. One thing I'll say about eResources is that you have to kind of let some of the territorial things go. Like if you think that the way that you add value at your position is by running usage statistics, that's not true. And I've met a lot of eResources people who are very protective of what they do, and I understand that, I do, but you need to have a lot of this information out there, because where you're really going to be adding value is on that earlier slide that I had, where you've actually developed all of these skills to manage. It's like project management is actually how I deal with eResources. And so if you're real focused on the fact that you're the only one with admin credentials that can log into EBSCO admin and run your usage consolidation report, then you're in trouble. You should be happy if anyone else wants to do that for you. And this leads up to what you're saying, which is I create these, they basically, when I started the new job, I just create documents that are pages, like topic per page, about what the workflow is. And it's just because I'm having to learn it at a new institution. But then what that becomes, or became when I left my last job, is a document for them to have so they could see what was going on. And also, it's so easy today with shared drives to create documents like, this is the process for purchasing individual books from Gobi. This is what happens after Gobi. These are the emails that come in. This is what you need to do, how you need to test it, how you need to activate it, and all my things like that. So no one understands that more important, especially when you're in a position of management. We call it like training, cross-training and things like that. How do you find that right line of, you're not trying to make two people doing the same job, but someone needs to know enough to help out if something happens to that other person. So definitely, it's complicated. And then everybody weirdly develops their own ways of doing this, so it's not even standardized, even though I tried to standardize as much with the workflow.
Do you make workflow diagrams, or do you just write narrative?
No, I make workflow diagrams, especially at my institution now. It's very complicated. There are a lot of people involved. I think we have, so at my previous institution, like I said, we had 14,000 FTE, and I think the library fully staffed was 42 people. In my current institution, we have 8,000 FTE around there, and we have like 300 people in the library. So it really depends on where you are, and that's why so much of it is involved in communication, relationships, but I definitely actually try to diagram things out, especially the process for subscribing to new resources and renewals. Those go into separate categories when you're dealing with this, and you need to have a workflow chart, one that isn't the nonsense one that I put up. I probably should have done the real one for you, but just to show you that it can get very complicated, it can loop around, there can be, it stops here, and then guess what, you get to go all the way back to the beginning and start again. So there's a lot of that involved in this work.
I have one question about your ticketing system.
Yeah.
So we use SpringShare products as well. I was curious where the access points were for your patrons to be able to provide that ticket. Is it just on the website? Is it in the resource? Where would that be?
So we have, and this is a little bit, I can't answer it fully, but right now it is posted on a lot of LibGuides, but there's also a system, and we have a dedicated library IT department where if a resource doesn't display, the error message actually displays the link to the ticketing system. So if something fails, the person right there at the point of the need says, click on this and report the issue, and then it goes right to us. I can't explain how all that works.
I was just
yet,
curious
but-
about if you
No,
have
it's
more
great,
than-
yeah, it's really helpful, because that is one of the problems is getting it out there. The issue is, like I said earlier, sometimes by the time a person gets to you, they've already talked to 3 people and they're very frustrated, and they're really upset that you're saying, we need to go back to the beginning. I didn't even talk about the screenshots and screen recordings that I make. Always get it as visual as quickly as possible. There's nothing worse than being on the phone or the email trying to describe something you see on a computer screen to someone. It's pointless. But the patron's so frustrated, that's what they want to do. So do screenshots, and you send it back and you say, follow from screenshot 1, and tell me at which point you don't see what's on the screenshot, and then email me what's on your screen. It goes so much faster, and then screen recordings are even better. There's a lot of great free software out there you can use to make under 15-minute videos. Great compression, you can email it, get visual as fast as possible with access issues, because I have had reported to me the library is down. The library's not down. It's just saying. I would have heard from more than one person if the library was down. So, all right, thank you everybody. Email me if you have questions. I appreciate you coming.